You're all very welcome to tonight's program. We're delighted to see such a great crowd out for such an important issue. My name is Niamh King. I'm the Vice President for Programs here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I'm delighted to welcome our panelists tonight, Lina Sergie Attar from the Karam Foundation, Gregory Maniatis from the Migration Policy Institute in DC, Professor Bob Pape from the University of Chicago, and Cameron Hudson from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC. I'd like to first off thank the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for working with us to develop this program. I went and I met with Cameron in Washington, and they have an absolutely amazing establishment there. I'd recommend you go to it. It's wonderful about history, and it's also excellent on contemporary issues. So we're thrilled for their partnering with us. Thank you very much. Jill Weinberg was also critical in the success of this program. Tonight's program is on the record. You can use your social media, but please silence your phones so that it doesn't disrupt the programming. And we'll be live streaming this too. A few upcoming programs I'd like to mention. First one, on January 20th, we'll be hosting a debate on drone strikes. It should be fascinating, between Alberto Cole, who's a law professor at DePaul, and Mary Ellen O'Connell, who's a law professor at Notre Dame, two different perspectives. And then we're delighted to be welcoming Secretary Bob Gates, the former Secretary of Defense, back to the Council on January 26th. He was here before to a great crowd, and we're delighted to welcome him back when he'll be talking about leadership. That will be a members-only program, which leads me into a great idea for holiday presents. We're in the middle of Hanukkah. Christmas is coming. As you know, the Council is a public education institution founded by the generous support of our members. Thank you for supporting us. And it's our goal to make conversations like today affordable to everyone in the public and the wide audience, students and groups who can't afford it. Thank you for making it possible. And now's a great time to get your membership and sign up for the Bob Gates program. So I'll be back up for Q&A, but now if you could help me in welcoming to the stage Bill Mahoney, who's a very valued member at the Council. He's co-chairman of Siegel, McCambridge, Singer, and Mahoney, and active in the Chicago community as chairman of the Chicago Committee for Human Rights Watch, and as a member of the Chairman's Council of NDI, and a great Director Circle member at the Council. Thank you.
Thanks, Niamh. Welcome all. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. What an impressive turnout. We are honored to welcome a truly distinguished group of panelists to the Chicago Council of Global Affairs this evening. This is a very, very important program. We are grateful, but not surprised to see such a large audience. Sadly, we all know why. The Syrian refugee crisis is severe. In fact, it is extraordinary. It is the largest refugee crisis since World War II. Tonight, we shall reflect on how we got here, what are the options available to us to meet the crisis, and where we are going as an international community. First, some of the facts. More than 4 million Syrians have fled to neighboring countries, particularly Lebanon and Turkey, since the outbreak of the Syrian civil war. Over 50% of the Syrian population has been effectively displaced from their homes. Europe alone has over 1 million refugees seeking asylum or migrating or seeking refugee status, and they've arrived on Europe's shores only 2015, over 1 million souls. The flow is increasing. The humanitarian and political consequences are indeed profound. The international community is being tested, and tensions are rising in many of the countries that are confronting with how to deal with the refugee crisis. As we know, the EU is struggling mightily to adopt a unified, coherent consensus policy in face of the migration crisis. The United States, our own United States, is debating how many refugees to take, whether to take them at all, or whether to establish a religious test for who to take. ISIS is striking fear in many Western countries, both by some of their battlefield successes in the Mideast and their acts of terrorism in Western cities, which is putting very significant pressure on how the countries in the West are going to respond to the refugee crisis. Our panelists hopefully will have answers to these questions. At minimum, I think they can identify the issues for us. Their complete bios, which are distinguished and indeed extraordinary, are on your chairs, and I urge you to read them, and I'll briefly introduce them now. Our moderator is Cameron Hudson. Cameron, in addition to being the director of the Simon Skjodt Center for Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, is actually a friend of mine. We went to Rwanda together last year, and he's an extraordinary, he has been an extraordinary public servant. Lina Sergie Attar is co-founder and CEO of the Karen Foundation, which runs innovative humanitarian and assistance programs for Syrian refugees on the border areas in southern Turkey. Gregory Maniatis, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, is Senior European Policy Advisor at the Migration Policy Institute in D.C., and advisor to Peter Sutherland, the UN Special Representative for Migration. And finally, Robert Pape is Professor of Political Science here at the University of Chicago. He specializes in international security issues and is director of the University Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the moderator and our panelists to the stage.
So good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on a great night, actually. I was expecting colder weather in Chicago, so I'm pleasantly surprised. I want to thank the Chicago Council for convening this discussion and for working with the museum to help really frame up what we're going to be talking about tonight, for all of our panelists for joining us, and to Bill Mahoney for that nice introduction. I want to take the privilege of the moderator's chair to help us just sort of set the stage for tonight's discussion, and Bill has already given us a little bit of bookending for what I hope will keep us on track. This conversation could go in a lot of different directions, running the full range of hard power and soft power issues, and so I want to try to keep us on a common thread as we debate and discuss these issues, and then in the latter half of the conversation bring all 600 of you into this intimate discussion. But I wanted to just sort of remind us of some of the larger issues that I think framing this discussion for me and the work of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, but also I think which is sort of being driven through the presidential campaign and policy discussions, informed and uninformed, I think, right now in Washington and in various cable news outlets, and to try to bring some grounding into the discussions that have been taking place. So nearly 5 years into what started as a civilian uprising, itself an outgrowth of the Arab Spring protests, an ever-metastasizing civil war in Syria has now taken the lives of more than 300,000 people. So many, in fact, that the United Nations no longer is keeping count of the dead. From this has grown an international humanitarian crisis, which we know all about. More than half the Syrian population is displaced. That displacement has created vacuums across the region that have been filled by terrorist groups, which, beyond demonstrating the unique genocidal intent within the region, unlike other terrorist groups, the Islamic State has now demonstrated the capacity to act upon that intent, a new challenge that we face, bringing together counterterrorism and genocide prevention in a new way and a new challenge for public policymakers. These effects have spawned terrorist threats across Europe and now even in the homeland of the United States, a refugee crisis that is testing the unity of European institutions and that could have far-reaching effects for the politics and the societies of these nations well into the future. So that's just a glimpse of the menu of, I think, interconnected challenges we face both at home and abroad. My institution, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, sits at the crossroads of many of these issues, and I think I would be remiss if I didn't try to remind us of some of the history, that the challenges that we face today are not unique to this generation. Other generations of leaders and citizens have faced many of the same challenges. Bill noted that this is the greatest number of displaced since World War II. 80 years ago in Evian, France, we convened a group of world leaders to discuss what we would do about the then European refugee crisis. And we Americans and collectively the world decided that we would not lift racial and ethnically based migration and immigration quotas that prevented Jews from fleeing Nazi Germany. To the most callous application of that policy, where a year later, nearly 1,000 European Jews aboard the St. Louis were denied entry into the United States multiple times and forced to return to Nazi-controlled Europe. In response to those two incidents, Germany's Nazi government at the time declared, quote, that we were astonished that foreign countries would criticize Germany for its treatment of Jews, though none chose to open their doors to them when the opportunity was offered. So were the Germans right at that time? We put some polling data out there as you walked in. Some of you might have seen it. You might have seen it on social media that in 1938, 3/4 of Americans believed that we needed to not lift quotas on European Jews seeking to leave the country. When we knew about the death camps in Nazi Germany in 1944, those numbers remained exactly the same. So we faced some of these very same questions before, fearing that Jews at the time were communists, that they were un-Americans, that they were the fifth column, that they would come and disrupt American ways of life and society. We've heard some of these debates before. We're hearing them again today as we sit here. So we have for ourselves the not so enviable task of making sense of all of these dangerous and even conflictual narratives, and of seeking answers to, I think, a very basic question that we as citizens and our leaders face every day, which is, why is it that when there seems to be such tremendous overlap between American interests and American values, so little has been accomplished in the last 5 years to avoid the current refugee crisis and to stem the outflow from the Syrian civil war? I think the bigger question that we have to face tonight is, what are the consequences if we continue our current approach to this problem? And I truly hope that with all of the great minds in this room and on this stage, we can come up with some new ideas that we haven't thought about before and that are worthy of broader discussion. So with that, and with that short transgression, I want to start and open it up with you, Lina, because you have been most recently in the border regions with Syria, sort of closest to the cradle of all of the problems that we've talked about. I want you to remind this audience, first of all, who these people are who are fleeing, what they are fleeing from Syria, and what are the conditions that they're facing when they get across that border, when you're coming face to face with them. What are the stories that you're hearing from them?
Thank you, Cameron, and thank you to the Chicago Council for hosting this event. I'm actually very overwhelmed by the turnout in the audience, and I'm very happy that so many people decided to come here today, because obviously you all care about Syria and Syrian refugees, and that's very heartwarming for me to see that and see this outpouring of compassion for refugees that we've seen over the past few months, especially from the American and international community. When I go to the border, I've been doing that now this was my 6th mission since 2013, and every time I go, it's different. Every time I go, I meet refugees who've been there 6 months longer, and this time when I met refugees that are only 2 to 3 weeks out of Syria because of the Russian aerial strikes on northern Syria. So you have now a mix of refugees that have been there for many years, and some of them been there for a few weeks, and that is not an extra complication to the problem, which is people trying to adjust to daily life as refugees, and people thinking ahead to where they should go. I wanted to remind everybody that for the past 4.5 years, every single day in Syria, Syrians face the same terror that the people of Paris faced during the attack. This happens every day inside Syria, and that is what Syrians are fleeing. They're fleeing the bombs, they're fleeing the beheadings, they're fleeing terrorism, they're fleeing their government's bombardment. And so when I go, we try to not focus on all of that. We turn all of the news off. When I'm on the border, I work with the kids directly, and we focus on the future. and we put our blinders on and we talk to kids directly on how they can become better in their lives and how we can build a better Syria for the future and better Syrians through education, through innovation, through technology, because all we see in the world as Syrians and Syrian Americans is a complete and utter failure of the international community on the political levels, from the top level all the way down. So we want to focus on the things that we can change, and we can change lives through education and through awareness, turn kids away from despair, turn them away from going on a leaky boat to Europe, and try to help them envision a new life for themselves.
Can you talk a little bit about the location of, because I think there's a kind of a general sense that these millions of people are in camp-like settings, when in fact they've actually dispersed kind of broadly across the region. Can you sort of unpack for us some of the differences in, because this is not a sort of typical refugee crisis that you would see in, a natural disaster or in a civil war that we've seen in perhaps other African contexts or something like that. So explain to us a little bit about how that's playing out and what that means on the ground.
Absolutely. I think there is a misconception that people think all of the refugees are living in camps, when actually a fraction of them are living in actual camps that are administered by UNHCR and large refugee aid organizations. The majority of Syrian refugees are urban refugees. For instance, in Turkey, only about 300,000 of the Syrian refugees live in Turkish camps run by the government and aid organizations, and the rest, almost 1.7 million Syrian refugees, are urban refugees living in storefronts, in unfinished homes, in crowded homes, living off of whatever savings they have left leaving Syria, which is very little and dwindles very, very fast, which is the reason why so many Syrians in the last 6 to 9 months have decided to take these death routes to Europe, because there is no more hope of living in places like Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, where their opportunities are very, very little, and they're seeing that the crisis is not ending so that they could return home, which is what all Syrians really want, is to return home. And so I think people should also understand, when you watch especially the migration across Europe, you have to understand that the Syrians who are able to get on these boats and are able to pay smugglers to get to places like Germany and Sweden, they're paying thousands and thousands of dollars to smugglers to be able to get out. So this is middle-class Syrians. These are educated people. These are people who have businesses in Syria and are trying to make it to Europe. The people that I work with on the Syrian-Turkish border, they dream of taking that route. They can't even afford it.
So Gregory, let me bring you into this conversation and get you to help us understand, I think, something that has perplexed me and hopefully you can shed some light on. And that's, I think, just from a really basic level, what are we talking about when we talk about the difference between a migrant and a refugee? Because I think one of the interesting things that Lina has touched upon here is that many of the people who are sort of voting with their feet and deciding to leave the kind of urban environments that they're in are doing it for a better life. And so we've heard the debates within Europe, in Hungary, for example, where people have said these people are not fleeing Assad. They're coming for economic reasons. They're coming for seeking a better life, not for fleeing persecution. And how should we understand those differences, and what are the implications of those differences from a policy perspective? Because we've seen, I think, a real disconnect between EU member states and EU institutions in how they've approached this problem. And I'm wondering if there's an important nuance there that our collective discussion has missed.
Thank you. Simple question.
Yes.
First, I want to echo what Lina said. It is great to see so many people here caring about this issue, and I hope that you take what you hear out into your communities and make something of it. Because what has happened, even more in the United States than in Europe, which is surprising, is that this has become an elite conversation dominated by security. And what we saw in the summertime, which was a human popular reaction in Europe, people helping people, has now been overwhelmed by an Orban, Trump-like overlay that deadens community involvement and the human reaction to what's happening. So I'm really thrilled by how many people are here. A migrant versus a refugee in law is fairly straightforward. A refugee is somebody who, under the 1951 Refugee Convention, which came out of World War II, can show a credible fear of persecution. There's more layers to that, but we'll leave it at that. And a refugee who can prove that under international law has a right to enter another country. It is the only major ceding of sovereignty that the state actually concedes, right? So if you are somebody who is fleeing persecution, you can go to another country and have a right to enter that country and to not be sent back to where you were fleeing from. Now, that's a fairly straightforward definition. It's applied differently in different countries, but it's fairly straightforward. The argument that many in Europe make is Syrians leaving Syria end up first in Turkey or Lebanon or Jordan principally, and those countries are safe countries. Now, Turkey is the only signatory of the 1951 Refugee Convention, but Lebanon and Jordan have mostly been receptive to Syrian refugees. And thus, Europeans are given an excuse to say, well, there was no need for them to go further. In Turkey, they had protection, which is where most pass through. So once they leave Turkey, they are no longer refugees, they're economic migrants. Now, that's demagoguery because, in fact, if you do reach France or Germany or Greece, you still have a right to apply for asylum. Now, it's possible that there's an agreement between those European countries and Turkey that allows them to send you back, but even that's complicated because European courts can say, hey, Turkish conditions, not so great for refugees, you can't send them back, right? So, but the law is fairly straightforward. You have a right to enter any country, not just the neighboring country, if you can prove a fear of persecution. So that's the basis of what we've seen. Now, I think a basic principle of what we have experienced over the past year is that we have come to think that proximity to the conflict zone somehow defines responsibility. Proximity does not define responsibility. Syria is a global responsibility. That doesn't mean that the world necessarily has to share refugees in equal number based on our populations, but it means that we collectively have to look at the problem and figure out how we're going to solve it. I'll give you just one example of how that system has failed. Europe, a year ago, 2 years ago, could have supported Lina's organization and other organizations in those countries around Syria, and it would have meant that people who were fleeing Syria could stay closer to home. Most want to stay closer to home. They don't want to have to cross the Mediterranean and risk their lives. But instead of providing what was then a few $1 billion of support, and today might have been in 2015, maybe we would have provided $10 billion of support to those frontline countries. We failed to do that. Instead, Europe will have spent over 40 billion euros this year to deal with the flows into Europe. Just this year, not next year and the year after, and the ongoing cost of it. So there was a massive failure by Europe and the international community to support the frontline countries and take care of refugees there. And I'll say one more thing and wrap it up. The other really self-inflicted wound of the Europeans was that they resisted international help. And this is a much deeper conversation about the blame game that goes across the Atlantic and around the world regarding Syria. The Chinese and Russians and others think this is a Western problem. Many Europeans blame the problem on the Americans, the Middle East problem. And so there is a lot of confusion about responsibility, but the basic fact is that the Europeans did not want the UN and the international community involved earlier this year. And as a result, they turned what was a global problem into a European problem and then failed to solve it.
So, Bob, you're going to give us the answers that we're all looking for here. I left to the University of Chicago professor. I know you're going to have these answers. It's become almost axiomatic that all problems begin and end in Syria, right? And so if we could somehow just achieve some kind of political settlement, if we could somehow dislodge Bashar al-Assad from office, if we could somehow end the Syrian civil war, mount a more robust response to the conflict there, that we could stem this refugee outflow and our problems would be solved. That's a fairly grand strategy, grand narrative. Help us understand either how that's the right approach or where the gaps in our thinking are about encapsulating that in a simple grand strategy.
Sure. Let me give and it is great to see so many people here. I just want to add my voice to this. It shows just what an international city Chicago has become. In the 80s, the Chicago Council was more of a committee. It is now a real global force. So it's really just amazing to watch that growth. I asked the Chicago Council to print out some maps. They're in color, which was very nice of them to do. And if you don't mind, I'm a professor, and so I like to talk with visuals. And if you look at the map of Syria, it's a color-coded map of where, not just Syria, but where people live in Syria, where the Sunnis live, the Druze live, the Alawites live, the Christians live, the Kurds live. And notice what a mess that is of where people live in Syria. If you go to the other side, you'll see a map of Bosnia. And a lot of you will remember in Bosnia, we had another multifaceted conflict, sectarian, all kinds of things happening. Look at the settlement patterns where people lived in Bosnia. Serbs mixed in with Croats, mixed in with Muslims, and look what a mess the middle of the country was. Well, just as in Bosnia, things got way out of control once the killing started. It was really hard to stop. You had 200,000 refugees fly out of the 4 million people in Bosnia. 100,000 dead before things stopped. Why? Because of that intermixed settlement pattern, which basically had to, so now let's go back to Syria. So the problem with why this is so big of a problem is because Syria is literally worse than Bosnia. Syria is the kind of intermixed settlement patterns that are going to produce this, which was why it was a bad idea to call for Assad's ouster. I know he was a bad guy. I know he was hurting his protesters. But unfortunately, what we got was something we should have known we were going to get when we lived through Bosnia. Hillary Clinton lived through Bosnia, okay? I'm sorry, I don't have an explanation why they didn't apply the lessons of Bosnia to Syria. They did in Bahrain and elsewhere. But so step number one is understanding how we got here, which is that what we're seeing is the unwinding of these populations in Syria. Number two, I think that what this is probably going to point to the future that's coming. It's a matter of when, not what the future is, which is these populations are separating. And as those populations separate, there will probably come a point when there can be some stability in Syria. I don't think it'll necessarily be this year, but I don't think it'll be 10 years from now either. So I'm not ultimately pessimistic, although things might get worse before they get better. And it also points to a possible political solution. So in Bosnia in the 90s, those of you who lived through that time might remember a lot of people were mad at the Serbs because they looked like they were doing a lot of the killing, just like we're mad at Assad because he's doing a lot of the killing. Well, what we did was we compromised. We said, okay, the Serbs will have their part of Bosnia. The Muslims will have a part, the Croatians will have a part. And what Bosnia is today is not run by the Serbs or the Muslims or the Croatians. It's a government that holds together with a very weak central government. And it's the local areas that really run things. I think that's Syria's future. And to be specific, I think that we shouldn't be calling for Assad to leave or deciding we're in bed with Assad. We should be accepting autonomy for different parts of Syria as we go forward. The Alawites are the green. It would be a really bad idea to put the Alawites under any Sunni government. It'd be a bad idea to put the Sunnis under an Alawite government again. So a better solution is to head toward a Bosnia-like solution where we use transitions over the next year or two to head toward a devolution of the central government.
Let me just pick up on that theme then and kind of abuse the Bosnia metaphor, because we will recall that our robust involvement in Bosnia came after Srebrenica.
Yeah.
And so the question is, have we had our Srebrenica moment in Syria? Is it still to come? If it is still to come, what does that look like, and what should be the U.S. response?
So just to be clear, even after Srebrenica, there was never a ground army by the United States that went into Bosnia. What went into Bosnia was special forces, just a small number, and also some air power, but a clear vision of what would come with this concept called devolution. Richard Holbrooke at the time, was the architect of this idea. And so it wasn't exactly, did we have to put an army in or not? It's, did we have a vision that we could live with? And this is a vision that means compromise on all sides. Iran would have to compromise that there will be a Sunni autonomous region in Syria. The United States is going to have to compromise that there will be an Alawite region in Syria. So Assad may stay or not, but this is the compromise for the US. And then Russia is going to have to compromise because Assad doesn't get all of Syria back. So this is what happened in Bosnia to make those intervention steps add up to something. At the moment, there is no political reasonable way forward, so it's no wonder we have fighting here, we have squabbling by Iran, the United States, Turkey and Russia fighting shooting down airplanes. It's because we need to think about what would be a political future that we could all live with. It's not our preferred future, but we can't go back to 2010. That's just not there. And we've got to find a way to shut this one down for all the reasons that you're hearing. And that is going to mean thinking seriously about the politics of the future of Syria. And I'm suggesting that we use Bosnia as the reasonable model here, where again, you have autonomous zones and you still have a central government, but it's a very weak central government. In Bosnia, the central government actually doesn't do a whole lot. And that's not bad. That's not the Bosnians today, it's not wonderful, but it's not war.
Mm-hmm. Lina, I want to bring you back into the conversation because you, unlike the three of us on this panel, have real stake in the future of this country. And I want to ask you the question I just asked Bob about this sort of Srebrenica moment, because I think we always assume that the conflict that we're in is not going to get worse. It can't get worse than what we're already seeing, and we can't fathom a future in which the atrocities expand and the refugees expand. But when you're with the people fleeing this violence, what is their vision of the future? Do they think that they have any prospects of returning, and do they think that this is going to get worse before it gets better?
The people on the ground, their questions to me have changed every time I've gone back. The first time I went back in 2012, everybody was asking the same question: where is the world? Where is the world? Where is America? Why isn't anybody coming to stop Assad? Why isn't anybody stopping the airstrikes? 6 months later, where is the world? Why are the barrel bombs not stopping? 6 months after that, how could we have been struck by chemical weapons and nobody did anything? And I don't think, I've watched so many atrocities over the last 4.5 years. I've seen things that I never imagined that I would ever see in my life. And every time I see something, I think I could never see something worse. And I don't think that there is a real game changer moment for Syria like there was in Bosnia, because I don't think that the world really wants to end the conflict. And I think that's what Syrians believe. When I've been going back for the past year now, 2 missions, I've been back and nobody asks the question, where is the world anymore? They've given up on the world helping them. They've decided that they're going to have to endure whatever they have to endure through, and they don't think that anybody's coming to stop the barrel bombs or the airstrikes or ISIS or any of that. And we're watching our people dying every single day. And I think that Syria should have been treated like Bosnia, and we solved Bosnia. We solved Bosnia, and we solved it after 36 months. It would be a miracle if we could have the Bosnia solution. But I think that we are past that point.
So Gregory, I didn't script that we would be using the Bosnian parallel, but I'm willing to go with it for the purposes of our conversation. Because part of the stake of Bosnia was that it was in the heart of Europe, right? And we have seen some of the sort of secondary and tertiary effects of what's going on in Syria really playing out in some surprising ways in Europe. We saw this weekend the far-right party in France gain a big electoral win in regional elections, and there's talk that this is the new future of French electoral politics. We've seen it in Hungary, we've seen it in Greece, we've seen rising extremist parties, far-right parties, and they seem to be seizing on the occasion of this refugee crisis. And I'm wondering if you can help us to understand domestically what are the implications for Europe if we don't find a solution to this problem soon.
Sure. Let me weigh in for a moment on this Bosnia question, though, because I think it would be maybe a mistake to draw that analogy from the point of view possibly that so much was different. I mean, you had a superpower back in Bosnia. You had Superman in Dick Holbrooke. You didn't have ISIS, which is perceived as an existential threat. You didn't have Russia. And so possibly thinking, not that your point about separated, divided, or a loose federation isn't right, but if we content ourselves with that analogy, we might miss the bigger picture. The bigger picture in that respect when it comes to Europe is that in 2015, Europe is dealing with its third serious crisis of the decade. The first was the financial and the Greek debt crisis. The second was Russia's invasion of Georgia and subsequently of Ukraine. And now it's a migration and refugee crisis. After 3 crises, the European Union is on its knees. It has done the easy work over the course of the past 2 decades of trying to integrate, but when it came to the really hard issues, when it came to finances, when it came to foreign policy, and when it came to identity, it has gotten stuck. And this is the most dangerous of the 3 crises. And the reason why it's the most dangerous of the 3 crises, there are several reasons. One is just the cumulative effect of that, which is expressed in interstate relations. European states do not trust each other anymore. They are acting in defense of their own interests. They have largely given up on collective solutions. Even the country that has pursued the most positive solution, which is Germany, is going it on its own in many ways. It has decided it's going to solve the problem. So then there's what you mentioned, which is that those 3 crises have spawned extremist politics, both of the hard left, Syriza in Greece, or Podemos in Spain, but especially of the hard right, the nationalist right. It's on the rise. Number 1 party in Austria, close to number 1, if not number 1, in Sweden, in the Netherlands, and in a couple of other countries. We're not talking about Poland or Hungary and Slovakia. We're talking about the liberal heart of Europe is now being led the public debate by the hard right nationalists. So you have that as a factor, and then you have another factor, which is foreign countries intervening in European politics. So you have Russia abetting the hard right and the hard left in Europe, funding those parties, funding various movements that help those parties. And you have the Saudis who've been present in Europe for at least 2 decades, funding mosques, radical mosques. So you have a series of factors, but the most dangerous one now is the fact that everyone in Europe has an opinion about the refugee crisis. It heats up debate in every conversation. When it came to Greece, some people, I'm Greek, some people thought the Greeks were corrupt, they had opinions, but it really didn't get so heated, except between the Greeks and the Germans. When it came to Russia, there were some nerds like us who really cared about what was going on, but generally speaking, it was not the debate that took place at the dinner table or the tavern. This debate is taking place in every household. It's dividing families. And one of the most disturbing things that I've seen in my world is that even those who I consider to be progressive on the issue of migration and refugees, a large number of them recede back into very conservative positions very easily. It's a very volatile issue, and it's very easy to take it in one direction. And we've seen Chancellor Merkel in Germany take it in a positive direction. She is holding out. She, I think, is often, her motivations are often seen to be humanitarian. What she did in allowing Syrians to enter Germany after the Alan Kurdi photograph swept the world has been interpreted as, hey, we just have to do this. In fact, one of my bosses, Peter Sutherland, saw her a couple weeks ago at the Africa-EU summit in Valletta, and during the group photograph turned to her and said, "You're a hero." And she said, "What? I did it for Europe." And she was honest. She said that, and I think if you take that and you think about it, what she was saying is that this was the only way to try to save Europe's principles. This was a union founded on the idea of open, diverse societies. And the reaction this year was destroying that underpinning, not to mention destroying the Schengen zone. And when she stood up for Syrian refugees, she was defending European values.
So, Bob, I want to bring you back into this and ask the kind of the big picture question, the strategy question, because it seems like we've touched upon two real kind of, I don't want to say threats, but concerns to the sort of U.S. national security interest. One that Gregory has just outlined for us, which is, the implications of a weak and divided Europe and what that means as our strongest ally in the world when it comes to Russia, when it comes to China, when it comes to these sort of broad global forces. But the part that we haven't touched on yet that has been defined and is being defined as a true existential threat is the threat from ISIS. Mm-hmm. And that ISIS has been born of this conflict, is controlling now a third of Syria and a third of Iraq, has essentially erased a 100-plus-year-old border between those countries, and has an intent to commit these crimes and to control this territory. How should we understand the ISIS threat, and how do we disaggregate it from these broader problems that we have outlined already in Syria, the Assad regime, the civil war, the refugee crisis? How do we prioritize that new threat, just to add one more layer of complexity to it?
So let me talk about ISIS and then connect it back to Syria. The group we call ISIS, which is the same as ISIL, it's just how you transliterate the last word, emerged from a group called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which emerged out of our invasion and conquest of Iraq. So what happened in 2003 is there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. There was no terrorist group there. When we toppled Saddam, we created an anarchy inside of Iraq. There was a part of Iraq that never became well-governed space, and that was the part of the Sunni area of Iraq, which then spawned Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That's where that group came from. Over time, there was ebb and flow, and there's a long history there that I'll skip over. But with the Arab Spring and Assad in Syria, there became more ungoverned space. So if you have the ungoverned space in Western Iraq combined with the ungoverned space in Eastern Syria, now you've got the cauldron for the thing we call ISIS. You see what I mean? And it's a piecemeal or pieced together from those different elements. So what that means is, in the big picture, we've got to bring more governance to this ungoverned space. So then coming back to Syria, and if you don't mind me going back to my map. And so what's happened inside of Syria is, in the last year, ISIS's territory has shrunk by 10%. That's why, that's what happened with the air campaign plus the support of the ground forces, especially the Kurds. Its territory has shrunk, and ISIS now is lashing out like a cornered animal. As they're going down, They're lashing out. You see what I mean? So they know they're in trouble. What would it mean to put them in more trouble and then to actually create some governed space? Well, the reason I drew some circles here on this map is I think what we should be doing while we're kind of having the grand political deal I talked about, is we should be having more governed space just around the Kurdish areas to incrementally have more and more governed space inside of Syria. That is going to pose a real challenge to ISIS because many Syrians are living under ISIS control who just don't want to live there. And it's because of this problem, as I said, of ungoverned space. So if we don't incrementally bring some governedness to the space, then this is just going to be a problem. So the way to think about ISIS and Syria together is that the problem of ungoverned space is, I have to say, we helped create that problem when we broke Iraq. But we didn't do that in Syria, but we did in Iraq for sure. And what we need to do now is create more governed space and to do it incrementally. There's not going to be a D-Day where we come in and we just end this all with or an Incheon landing. That's just not going to create, because we need to create governed space, not defeat an army that's congealed that we're going to go in like a blast and shatter it to pieces. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. If we did that, we would have some temporary benefit, like we did when we shrunk AQI down, but we never built the governed space in the Sunni areas of Iraq. So okay, we got a temporary respite, but then we're right back in the soup because of the problem of ungoverned space. So that's really the thing we have to keep our eye on, is shrinking and putting back governed space in what is now the Wild West.
Mm-hmm. Lina, I want to bring you into this and get your response to some of what Bob has laid out in terms of how realistic you think, from your perspective, of having interacted with so many people fleeing. Do you think the sentiment is for achieving that kind of a peace settlement? Because when we talk about compromise, we talk about giving up a lot. People have already given up quite a bit to get to where they are. Do you see an appetite for that level and an opening for that kind of grand political bargain that would, in some ways, balkanize the country to going back to a Syria that's not existed before?
I think that what you're talking about in terms of defeating ISIS, I don't think that there has really been an appetite or a reality where anyone is actually fighting ISIS. I think there's a little bit of fighting, a little bit of letting go of that fight, and that's why we watched ISIS basically drive cars across the desert to take over Palmyra, and after they took over Palmyra, now the world is devastated that the archaeological ruins and the jewels of the world, which is actually not just Syria's history, it's universal humanity's history. We watched that being destroyed in front of our eyes after we let ISIS go there in open desert. So I don't think people are very serious about really fighting ISIS in a way that they can be defeated. But I also think that we weren't watching areas of Syria that were not governed by the Assad regime, like in northern Syria, in Idlib province, for instance, where I work very closely with the people there. For the past few years, a large area of northern Syria has not been under the Assad regime's control. It's only been bombarded by the airstrikes, which were getting weaker as Assad was getting weaker. And there are many, many examples of civil society flourishing inside Syria without anybody noticing or talking about it. We have people governing their police stations. We have schools functioning. We have hospitals functioning underground to protect themselves from barrel bombs. We have protests happening still every week. And now that area of Syria has actually been extremely weakened because of Russia's military strikes on areas that do not have any ISIS presence, including in Aleppo, the city that I'm from and Aleppo province, we're continuously seeing, we hear that on the media that airstrikes are to defeat ISIS in order to protect Assad. But in reality, the majority of Russian airstrikes are against Syrian civilians and also the Syrian military opposition that is not under ISIS control. So I think there's a lot of mix-up in the media of how this is portrayed. And if people were very serious, the international community was serious about fighting ISIS, the Syrian people have that support. They want ISIS out of the country as badly as they want Assad out of the country. ISIS is a foreign entity in our country that did not exist in 2011. It didn't even exist in 2012. It was born out of this vacuum, and we don't want it there. But I don't think anybody is really serious about defeating ISIS completely. I think it's more about containing ISIS. As long as it's not hurting anything else outside of Syria, we're okay with that. And I also think that when we talk about big picture, I think I would like the people here today, and one of the things to take forward with you is to realize that this problem is much, much bigger than Syria now. I think what we have to face as global citizens is that we have watched the failure of almost every single issue that we as human beings should hold very dear to us. What does it mean to have humanitarian intervention? When you talk about intervention, everybody wants to talk about Iraq and the failures of Iraq, but there is a need in the world to redefine humanitarian intervention. There will be a time when another country will be going under what Syria is going now, and we need to be prepared. The humanitarian aid world is outdated. It's not, the refugee crisis, we don't know how to deal with large migrations of people. We don't know how to deal, what is the role of this UN Security Council, for instance? They do nothing. I'm sorry if anybody works here for the UN, but I mean, I just see it as the big institutions and the big ideas that we think that we know exist in the world actually are broken. There's broken systems all across, and I feel that we need to redefine all of these issues, and I think that we need to really use our creativity and our innovation and our technology. And it's 2015. How can 3,000 people be drowning when they're leaving a country to flee? How can we be letting thousands of people basically fund like multi-million-dollar smuggler routes instead of getting these people shouldn't have to drown to get out of Turkey. There should be refugee air. There should be Airbnb for refugees. There should be a way, really, there should be apps. We live in 2015. How can we have that happen? Refugee air, get people out of the country in a civilized manner. Get people's visas processed where they are. This is outrageous that you have to get on these boats. I mean, the media asks me, why do refugees not want to come to the United States? There's one reason why Syrian refugees aren't coming here. The only reason is because they can't swim here. I mean, that's the reality. So we have to work together, people who have corporations, people who have technology companies. We need to work together because the politicians, the pundits, the military people, it has been a massive failure. And it's on us as human beings to solve these issues. And not for Syria, it's for all of us.
So can I just second that?
Please.
So I couldn't agree more with what you just said. There is actually refugee air. It was started by Swedish entrepreneurs who are trying to bypass regulations to get, with the cooperation of the Swedish government, refugees from the region into Sweden. There is Airbnb for refugees. It's called Refugees Welcome. It operates across much of Europe now. It's hampered by regulations. But this is, I think, the main point, which is Syria is not about Syria. Syria is about a whole series of forces that are playing out in Syria. It's about the changing dynamics of global power and Russia's assertion of itself in that space, not only in the Middle East, but in Europe. It's about global inequality, right? That is, I think, one of the reasons why Chancellor Merkel acted as she did. She felt that that was a major problem in the world, and she felt that this was one way of starting to redress it. I think it's going to come down to what Lina just said, which is you will either have a popular uprising, positive popular uprising, or you'll have populist politics that will create an umbrella of fear over countries. And it really is a matter of individual action, of giving to those organizations that are supporting refugees in that region, of getting your companies to participate in actions that support refugees, and then in doing what you said, building a better global humanitarian system. Peter Sutherland has fought for the whole of 2015 to persuade the UN to take leadership on this question of mass migratory movements. It hasn't been publicly announced yet, but there is going to be a leaders summit in September at the UN General Assembly on this issue of how you rebuild this humanitarian system and create a global system that shares the burden, financial burden, and the burden of hosting refugees more equitably across the world. That is the goal of that summit, and hopefully we'll start to address some of those questions.
So I want to just pick up on that because I think we've been talking about the humanitarian system, but what I heard from Lina is much more about the humanitarian spirit. And I think the humanitarian spirit is something that we as Americans pride ourselves on as having. And I think we've seen in the last several weeks and months that this crisis has unfolded a real shock to our humanitarian spirit and a rise in fear and fear-mongering on the backs of victims of persecution, victims of ISIS, victims of Assad, and a real and I think very distasteful, something that we shouldn't be proud of, fear that has emerged. That has really struck me, and I don't know if it's the political atmosphere that we exist in right now in a campaign, or what it is. But Lina has touched on it, but I want to bring all of you in to kind of help us address how we've conflated fears of terrorism with fears of refugees and migrants, and what that means for this, not just this humanitarian system, but this humanitarian spirit of Americans.
So I'd like to just make a point that the humanitarian spirit that Cam's talking about is not just about our values, it's about our security. And I've heard a lot in the last couple weeks about how there's our security on one hand and our values or civil liberties on the other. I think this is a big mistake. It's security versus security, and let me explain what I mean. ISIS, I study ISIS's videos. I do it with our National Counterterrorism Center. ISIS's videos are full of denigrating America's humanitarian spirit toward Muslims. They're painting a vision of America that hates Muslims. And they quote rhetoric from Americans on this issue to paint that picture. That also helps them recruit. That is part of their recruitment. Further, that issue of our humanitarian spirit, as it scares American Muslims, and American Muslims now are terrified after what's happened in the last few weeks, means they're much less likely to cooperate with the FBI, to cooperate with our security. Say one more point on this. Let me talk about the Bush administration. I spent a lot of time during the Bush administration talking to the FBI and to CARE, one of the grassroots Muslims organizations. The Bush administration let in thousands of people from Pakistan, one of the most anti-American populations on the planet, to be blunt about it. They let in people from Iraq, who, remember Iraq, trying to kill us at this point in time, okay? And why did they, and many other countries in the Middle East, why did they do that? They did that because it was important to challenge the terrorist view of us as hating Islam and Muslims. They also gave vast amounts of money to Pakistan for earthquake relief. They did it kind of quiet. They didn't want to go overboard, but this was important. Further, the Bush administration fostered discussions between the FBI leaders and the leaders of US Muslims, American Muslims. Why did they foster those communications? It's because a lot of the plots that you see the FBI have picked up, they didn't get that through surveillance. They didn't get that through surveillance. Notice San Bernardino, there's no surveillance to pick up. They got that from tips, from basically people in the American Muslim community giving tips. Well, you got to keep that a little bit under the radar if you're going to make that work, but you've also got to set up an environment where that can work. And Bush was doing this because, or the Bush administration, because they realized the security value of working with American Muslims. And I think that's just very important to put on the table, that this is not about values versus security. This is how are you really going to catch those plots that are so hard to disrupt. You're going to have to work with Muslim community, and if you demonize it, if you make 3 million American Muslims your enemy, good luck trying to get those plots.
But it's also about values. It's also about values. It is, I'm a first-generation Greek American. Lina, you're first-generation Syrian American. We've both been active in our regions, our countries in Europe and in the Middle East and Syria. And we've been able to do that because of what we've learned here. And so I think you could turn the reaction to refugees on its head and think about our assisting refugees as being not only a humanitarian act, not only, as you're saying, also in support of Muslim communities, a security act, but also it is maybe the next generation of nation building. And by building humans who are able to then eventually, when your vision plays out and Syria is stabilized, go back into their region or not, or succeed here and send back money and send back knowledge based here, it could be the best way to rebuild nations rather than trying to send in our military and have them try to build democratic institutions. There is an opportunity here in this crisis to act well, to act humanely, but to also act intelligently and build a better future in that region, which is a better future for us too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you. Some of my Syrian American friends say that Germany did the best job, reaction and best decision because they're picking up all the best Syrians. Absolutely. And they're assets. Absolutely. They're going to have the best food and the best, technology and all these things. Steve Jobs is the son of a Syrian immigrant, and I wanted to say that that's true when I see it every day when I go work in Turkey with the kids. The kids that I see and the teens that I see are kids that you would not believe that they're refugees in the sense that you see on the media. I know a boy named Mustafa. He's in 10th grade. He taught himself 5 coding languages. He's a coding genius. He wants to be a computer engineer. I just met on my last trip a girl named Sara. She's 18 years old. She's now fluent in Turkish. She's already fluent in English. She wants to be in English. She goes to study English literature at university. I know a girl named Sabah. She wants to become a doctor. She only speaks to me in English. I speak to her in Arabic. She speaks back to me in English. And we had her interviewed by somebody who worked for CNN, and he talked to her for 15, 20 minutes. He's actually from Iran, and he came to me and he said, she reminded me exactly of when I interviewed Malala. These are the kinds of Syrian refugee youth that we want to invest in. We want to give them the best technology, the best entrepreneurship skills, the best journalism skills, and we want to open up the world to them. But we need to have a world that's accepting to them and open to them to come and be able to become better citizens, because even if they never return to Syria, that's also a possibility. We want them to be productive global citizens in whatever country they live in and contribute to their societies. And that's what we're trying to instill in the Syrians that we interact with. And we hope that the world will welcome them into their lives as people who have a very bright future and can brighten all of our futures together.
Thank you. Thank you very much to our panelists and Cameron. We'd now like to go out to the audience for questions. We only have a brief time, so if you could raise your arm and make sure that your question is a question. Yes, and please, if you have a specific panelist you'd like to, yeah, right there, please, the lady. If it's a specific panelist, you can let them know. Thank you.
I have a question for Lina. When you talked about the people of the United States doing something, the frustration I have is, what can I do other than give money? I mean, the volunteer organization Refugee One that settles Syrian citizens in Chicago, on their volunteer page, they actually say, thank you, but we can't accept any more volunteer applications. You know, we have too many people already. What can we do if we're not experts other than give money to other organizations?
I get that question a lot. Thank you so much. Giving money is actually one of the most important things that people can do. Especially here in the United States, we get the question constantly about how there are millions of Americans that are very, very generous and compassionate towards the refugee issue. And the question that I get all the time is, how do we help Syrian refugees in America? And the problem is that there barely are any Syrian refugees in America. We only have around 2,000 out of the 4 million. So other than giving money to organizations that are supporting Syrian refugees, the biggest thing you can do is talk about Syria in your community, in your schools, your churches, your synagogues, wherever you have communities of people who are confused on this issue, to tell them about what's going on, and also to ask this administration to, instead of shutting our borders down to refugees, to be opening up our borders way past the 10,000 that President Obama has already agreed to bring upon, and which may not even happen because of all of the governors who are fighting this. But these are things that Americans like you can do to try to help support the Syrian cause.
Thank you. Next question. Right here, please, in the front row.
Professor Pape, I like the idea of more autonomous region, but how do you handicap the chances of Iran, the Shias in Iraq, and of Russia allowing there to be a wide swath between the two countries of an autonomous Sunni area?
I think that it's actually better than 50-50. This is a lot like 93 in Bosnia, so this isn't close exactly to the end. I'm not saying this will be over in a month. But around 93 in Bosnia, we started to realize we were going to need real agreement. Russia was a big supporter of Serbia at the time. There were lots of problems in trying to coordinate that end of the Bosnian conflict that are very international. Saudi Arabia, there were hundreds of actually very radical Muslims floating into Bosnia. We don't even know about that now, but that was actually happening, and that was scaring a lot of people, so that what basically happened is there became an agreement in the international community that what they don't want to have is the further radicalization and destruction inside of Bosnia. That's really now happened. See, I think we don't need a Srebrenica already. We've already come to the agreement, to the conclusion that we don't want Syria to get any worse. We don't want the refugees to double. It could double. We don't want the deaths to go from 300,000 to 600,000. That could happen. And we don't want ISIS to expand its territory of control, because that's a threat to Iran, that's a threat to Russia, that's a threat to Western Europe. So I think we don't need a Srebrenica. We've had that Srebrenica moment already. And I think that and that's why we had the meeting this fall for the first time in among the key international players. And that's something that now at least, it's not quite the Bosnia solution I've depicted, but it's set up a framework within which further discussion could, I think, move in this direction. So I actually think that the big part was just getting those players to come together and talk in a serious way for the first time. That's already happened.
We have a school group, two school groups, St. Ignatius and Lab School. Any of those students with a question back there, please? Either side? Great opportunity. No extra credit from the teachers. Okay, we'll go back to the grown-ups. Okay, right over there, please. In the suit, right there. Yep, standing up. She's coming right.
I lived and worked in Macedonia for 3 years for an NGO. A lot of my friends and former colleagues who are still there have, just begun every day heading down to the border to give apples or shoes or anything to the refugees coming up. Macedonia has built a wall, a literal wall to stem that. What is while we're waiting for a more permanent solution, what's the temporary solution for Europe, and how could this really become a a major risk for Europe and the EU?
So the temporary solution is Germany at the moment, and Sweden. So Sweden has 190,000 refugees this year. So by population, the biggest per capita is in Sweden. Sweden and Germany are taking on the burden this year. I think that will continue to be the case for a while. I think there is hope for an agreement with Turkey and with the other frontline countries to provide them with a lot more support. The UN Refugee Agency yesterday opened up its by far largest annual appeal for $20 billion to help support the refugee system. There's a need for money in many other contexts as well, for housing, not just refugees, but also locals in these countries. So I think the solution will ultimately be, in the short term, more and more people being accommodated in Europe, in those 2 or 3 countries that are willing to do it, with a slow release of that tension, of that pressure, by having support go to Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. And that way you stem the flow and you reduce the political panic and the chaos that has existed. I think eventually you're going to need to have a global, more comprehensive solution where you have other countries. And some countries have really picked up the slack. Brazil has taken, I think, about 8,000 people so far and is willing to take many more. And Canada, by far the best example of a positive actor, was pressuring the UN Refugee Agency to deliver 25,000 Syrians to Canada by the end of this year. It was logistically impossible, but they wanted 25,000 this year and 100,000 next year. That would be commensurate with the US taking well over 1 million refugees from Syria. Canada's doing it, the US could do it. I just want to say one more thing, which is, it's a little bit demagogic of me, but there have been 790,000 refugees accepted into the country since 9/11. 3 of them have been linked to terrorist plots. None of them were able to affect any terrorist plots. It might happen. There might be connections in the future between terrorist acts here or in Europe and refugees, but that is absolutely no reason to reject the other 789,997 who came in. It's just crazy.
The young woman right there, please, the black.
Thank you all for coming. So it seems now that the dialogue about the Syrian refugees, and especially now about Muslims, with Donald Trump doing a lot of the talking, is actually very polarizing. So, Lina, I know that you said in particular that we should get up and speak about the issue, but much of the base of the people who are saying that we should not take any more refugees, that they're dangerous, that they're a security issue, aren't likely to be swayed, perhaps. So how would any of you suggest that these people, who might be a very loud minority, can be moved on the issue?
Bob, you want to take that?
Yeah, what I would say is that it's really important to confront people with the Bush administration. The Bush administration was as conservative as we get. So there's no more, it's not like they were liberals. The Bush administration did a lot of eavesdropping and did a lot of things against civil liberties. So it's not like they were, the administration of civil liberties. The key thing is to really confront the issue of what is in our security interest. Is it our security interest to make an enemy out of 3 million people? 3 million. So you treat 3 million as an enemy. This is a huge problem inside the United States. I'm hearing wacky things, like Trump talking about justifying FDR, what he did with the Japanese. That's barely over 100,000 Japanese. That's a very small population. So I'm just being very crude and talking security here. It's not that I don't have the values. I really do share the values. It's just that if we're really going to talk to people that are driven by security fears, you've got to talk about their security fears. And I think you just talk to them about the facts. And you say, let's talk about security. Let's look at how many plots the FBI has disrupted. those FBI plots, there are many dozens that have been disrupted, and they're getting help from the American Muslim community, and this started under the Bush administration. So this is what I think is really got to be brought front and center, and it's not, that's why I don't want to talk about the values, because the people you're talking about, they can't hear that conversation. They want to talk about security, so let's talk about security. And I think that the Bush administration had this one right.
Lina or Greg, any points on that?
I think that values are very important too, and I think that I'm Syrian American in a very, like a literal sense of the word. I was born in New York. My parents are here, and they're from Aleppo. They're both doctors, and when I was 12, we moved back to Syria, and they practiced their medical practice and built a very successful practice in Aleppo in over the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. I came back to do my graduate studies here, but when the revolution began in 2011, the reason why I felt so strongly about watching Syrians, regular Syrians, come out on the streets in a military dictatorship that I lived under and went to school under were my American values. I always grew up, when I grew up in Syria, I knew exactly what freedom felt like. I knew exactly what it felt like not to have people caring what you say or going to jail because of what you said. And my family wasn't some kind of political opposition family that you hear about, like so many Syrians that have people who went to jail. We weren't like that, but we just knew what was right and what was wrong. And I knew living there what was wrong about the country. And what was beautiful about the country was our family and our roots and knowing our history. But what was so terrible about it was that government. And so when I watched in 2011, we were watching something like it was a dream. We couldn't believe people would just come out on the streets and know what would face them. And those were very much in line with American values. All they were asking for was freedom and dignity. And now with the refugees, I mean, there is nothing, how could America be a country that's not open to refugees, that's not open to immigrants? What it's built upon, its foundation is accepting everybody and building something together that is so beautiful and so diverse. And so when I watched this rhetoric on the media, especially after the Paris attacks, I felt very disillusioned and disoriented. Is this the America that I know? Is this the America that when I lived in Syria, I yearned to come back to live in because I just wanted to have that freedom to be who I wanted to be? And losing that would be losing the essence of who we are. And that's what we should be facing these people with.
Greg.
So just two quick thoughts. One, just to reinforce what Robert said, I mean, I absolutely agree. You have to meet people where they are. You can't try to change them. You have to, without acknowledging their fears. And one thing that I always think about in these contexts is that you don't really have a pro-immigration camp and an anti-immigration camp, or a pro-refugee camp and an anti-refugee camp. There's a little bit of both in everyone, or a lot of both and a little bit of the other in everyone. And I think everyone has fear. Everyone fears change when it comes to their communities and their identity. And so the arguments that Robert is making should appeal to everyone. Also, though, I think that the security threat, which is really worth underscoring, isn't just from the Muslim community, if it does exist at all.
Right.
In France and Europe, you have not just several thousand foreign fighters from France and Belgium in Syria. You have to ask yourself, what happened there? Why are they doing what they're doing? And why do something like 20% of French 18 to 25-year-olds, 20% of French 18 to 25-year-olds support ISIS, have a positive view of ISIS? And those are deeper, harder questions that we have to confront at some point.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know there are lots of questions. Sorry, I'm sure our panelists will hang around for a few minutes to answer them, but please join me in thanking them for this wonderful, enlightening panel today.